Uh-oh.
What happened?
That's what the future is for smart buildings. I disappear. I may be having some internet problems, but I'm just going to continue to see how far I get. Panelists are listed on mondaylive.org. Most important here is the views expressed are personal and not of any company or organization. And let's have conversation on the Zoom chat. And in case you want any of the links on this deck, it's on mondaylive.org. So this is the last show of May, next week being Memorial Day, so we're going to be dark for that. But so this is the last opportunity we get to talk about climate change and buildings. And our agenda today is our normal chit chat, and then we're really going to focus on the impact of climate change on real estate.
I'll pretend to be Anto. Oh, no.
Join us in May.
Yeah. And I hand it over to Ken.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me better than they could Anto, because he's been missing a lot here. Automated buildings. I just wanted to point out that we'd kind of made a presence on Facebook, and I was kind of wondering about that. And Facebook's done a good job of supporting commercial presentation, and it's probably worth taking a look at. Although in the news today, I see that the EI is bringing a 2 billion sue against them for privacy. So we'll see how that all plays out. But anyway, just wanted to let you know that we are on Facebook, and I was surprised as to how many folks in our industry are actually on sort of industrial strength Facebook. So just a comment there. Audrey's post is great. If you were here for last week's discussion, she brought the concept of climate justice to the table, and it's kind of interesting. So she's written an article on that gives us a little bit more information. I think it's an interesting trend, because I think it is the client is going to be a bigger part of our future. We saw a lot of that during COVID. We saw an entry with indoor air quality kind of coming out of that. And now we're starting to see some of their desires to have their companies, make sure that their buildings are moving forward in a climate justice approach. I think I love those words for sure. The other thing I wanted to chat about is we've bound together all of our editors, and it links to all of their posts. So that's a tremendous amount of information from one HTML page. So we've got that online now, outlining them all. We've also provided their LinkedIn links. I'm thinking that we may evolve to include their Twitter and Facebook links as well, if they have them, and just gives you a little bit other, gets you to see them in another environment. And also it allows us to post from automated buildings, and you can quickly just click on these things and repeat your post on these social medias. And the only final remark is Project Haystack is in Nashville, June 5th and 7th. Project Haystack is one of our sponsors, and it looks like a great event they've got going there. Take a click on that and take a look at what's happening in Nashville. Back to you, Anto.
Hey, Anto and Ken, before you carry on, can we do a quick poll from the audience to see who's going to Haystack out of interest?
Okay.
Can you put up your hand if you're going up, if you're going to Haystack?
I'm in the participants.
Yeah. Let's see, 1.
2.
Okay.
So like Ken, you mentioned about Facebook and your experimentation there. Have any thoughts about Instagram? And the reason I'm bringing it up is I'm involved with my fraternity as an alumni head of their communications efforts, and that generation doesn't use Facebook for anything. And we've talked a lot about how do we bring the next generation into our world. What they do use around the clock is Instagram. So just curious whether you thought that might be something automated buildings would be looking at in the future.
Yeah, I've certainly looked at it. I have trouble trying to figure out how we would do that. It's mostly to share a thought or a feeling, and I'm not exactly sure that we have a lot of thoughts and feelings that can be quickly displayed and then disappear. So I'm still circling.
Well,
but
Audrey thinks I'm onto something, so it'd be good to chat with her further in what ways to do it.
great, maybe she can write me an article telling me about that. In fact, I haven't told her yet, but we're both we're working close with Eric at Control Trends, and we were talking about doing both of us interviewing her to try and get us old guys up to date. So that might be a good approach.
Yep.
I was going to bring on Audrey on panelist a bit later anyway. So moving on, Mark, you have some.
Yeah, I kind of thought this was very interesting, actually. So New York City is sinking. According to the latest, some late research, the island is sinking 1 to 2 mm each year, and
Millimeters.
yes, and this is equated to the extraordinary weight of the buildings and causing flooding threats that they've never had before, and so forth. I thought it was just quite interesting. So then I guess, in looking at this is they said, all right, so now us folks who live in the US, we got California falling off into the ocean. We got New York City sinking. And then I'm wondering how long it's going to be before the Palm Islands and all those islands that they created in Dubai is going to start to sink. So anyway, I just, this just kind of caught my attention. Something different.
It's not a new problem. It's happening. I think Houston's having some problems that way, and certainly Venice is. And it's not just always the building weight; it's how much groundwater they're extracting for both agriculture and civilian populations, which also affects causes a sinking problem.
Yeah, so I guess the moral of the story is we better go to New York City, do our visit before it actually falls under and ends up in Australia for some reason or something.
So in chatting with Mark prior to the show, I was just reminding him that Jakarta is another city that's sinking, and that's sinking by as much as 25 centimeters, not millimeters, centimeters a year.
Wow.
Yeah, I love these comments. Well, Audrey says Florida too. You're right, Audrey. And Roger, love this one. Don't sign any long-term leases to occupy the first floor in New York City.
You might get them cheap.
Yeah, exactly. A discount.
I don't know. I think there's some Dutch companies that we should be investing in. They've solved this problem for over 100 years. So
yeah, and scuba gear included when you sign your lease. But one quick thing about Project Haystack, and I appreciate folks mentioning it. We've got some really, really exceptional content that is going to be presented by lots of different people from the Department of Energy, from the labs, from users of Haystack, owners, and OEM stuff. So if you haven't made any decisions yet, one way or the other, do think about it, because there's going to be some really, really good content and folks there, and especially how data, continually changes our world. Every day it changes it. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Anto.
Great.
Yeah, pretty much the same stuff listed here. I did want to highlight that, down towards the bottom where we're prepping for grant applications. So we started that process and have had a couple of meetings and networking with a few different organizations that are aligned with us and that may have have some interest in helping to fund what the coalition is all about. So we're proceeding. I think we'll also have an update on the Young Professionals Group, what they're up to in the next couple of weeks. And oh yeah, back up to the top. Yes, I was one of the hands up for going to Haystack, and it'll be there for at least a day, and hope to spread the good word while we're there. And other than that, same old, same old.
So I put on chat the link to the big meeting on June the 1st, which is actually next week. In fact, although I actually put it on a private chat, so I'm going to do it again so everybody can see it. Right, there you go.
Oh, that's right. That's public knowledge now that the big meeting has been announced, and then so encourage everybody to spread the word.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rick. A couple of things that I saw. First one on the left is that the amount of vacancy in New York is equivalent to the space of, that's provided by 26 Empire State Buildings, just to put it into context, which is a lot.
Yeah.
And they also compared it to a number of other sort of big buildings, just to get it to sink in. And on the right, again, talking about AI, we have a sort of obviously an AI, constant AI theme going on with this group. And the thing that sort of struck me was, this is obviously mostly about the construction sector, so it's mostly about the construction process, although it touches on information for operations as well. But it just reminds us that the key ingredient always is human review. And again, it just reminds me that AI is the tool.
Yeah, unfortunately, Anto, your audio continues to be a real problem.
Okay, so I'm going to bring on David Wilkes, who's going to start his presentation, talk about what he's doing with his perspective with regards to regulatory sort of efforts. Hello, David. And I'm also going to bring on our resident sustainability evangelist, Audrey, to be part of this conversation. I'm going to switch machines while you're talking. So Dave, all yours, David.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Yes.
Yes.
Excellent, excellent. And then Anto, I'm going to share my screen too.
Shouldn't be an issue.
Can everybody see?
Yep.
Good. Okay, fantastic. Hi, everyone. I'm David Wilkes. I know a lot of you. If you don't know me, please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. I've been in the industry for a long time, and it's respectfully nice to not be the oldest one on the call.
Thanks, David.
I used to like you, David, not now.
Yeah. Now, yeah. I'm sorry, but the point is, though, that a lot of what we've seen and what we've been through is now becoming apparent to the next couple generations of folks in the business. And all of the things that I think a lot of us have been evangelists about for a very long time are finally coming to a point where the real estate owners are, I think we're at an inflection point where we're going to see some serious change. And I'm proud to be one of the older people in the industry because we have the experience and the lessons learned to help guide the industry to a better place. And as part of my work with ULI, I've been asked to lead their data forum. And the data forum, well, let me share with you the draft mission statement. And I'll give everyone a second to read this rather than me read it out loud. So a very light lift in terms of what we're trying to accomplish. But one of the things that we focused on with the data forum was the forthcoming SEC disclosure requirements. And that's something I spoke on. So we'd like to share two things today. First is these forthcoming SEC disclosure requirements and how we see them shaking out. And then I'd also like to share the data framework that we've been building, and it would be great to get everyone's feedback on that. So I'm going to now jump into the SEC reporting and disclosure. As Anto said at the beginning of the call, these opinions are strictly my own. If you want to do anything with this in terms of investment, have at it, but don't, we still don't know what's going to happen. So the bottom line, though, is the SEC made a general announcement and wrote a preliminary position paper about reporting around ESG, which is environmental, social, and governance actions that publicly traded companies take. And everyone has had a chance to respond, or if they care to respond, have responded. And the SEC is going to be issuing its initial approach and findings and requirements, most likely by September, if not sooner. And the SEC requirements basically come down to 4 areas of disclosure. One is the carbon and greenhouse gases via your utility use. And it also is your utility use for potable water, for instance. So all of your utility use needs to be reported. Then with that, from the source of your energy provider, at least, you need to know the mix of the greenhouse gases involved in the production. So if there's a higher amount of renewables or, on the other extreme, coal, you need to report the various percentages. You also need to be aware of the refrigerants that are in your systems and any renewable energy credits and offsets, as well as embodied carbon and hazardous material. All of this is real, and it will likely go into effect starting January 2024. And that means the reporting will commence in January 2025. The embodied requirements, though, it's anticipated that those will lag behind. And just so everyone knows what's anticipated with those embodied requirements, it's actually estimating the embodied carbon created in the creation of the building. And there are different methodologies that are getting more and more accurate over time. But obviously a lot of it's guesswork. But the thing that we can be sure of is that if your building's less than 30 years old, there will be some reporting requirements, because basically the embodied carbon is thought to depreciate at the same rate the physical asset financially depreciates at. So it is hoped that anything older than 30 years old will not be reporting or have to report embodied carbon, but there's a chance you may still anyway, but it's anticipated that this is not going to be one of the initial requirements coming through in the next few months. Now, I'm not sure who's aware of the different scopes, but on the screen here, we have scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. On the refrigerants and everything fall into scope 1. I kind of feel like the natural gas use on site falls into scope 1, but some people feel is still a utility, so it may be scope 2, but either way, you have to report it. And then scope 2 is your purchase electricity and the carbon footprint of that. It is anticipated that scope 3 will be included, but not strictly looked at. So that's going to roll in terms of more and more severity, but it's very different depending on the corporation. So if you're a Walmart, your scope 3 could include all of your providers and manufacturers that provide things you sell in your stores. So that scope 3 could be quite extensive for a number of organizations, but today's focus is on real estate, so we won't have to open that can of worms. So when we look at all of this reporting, it can really go two ways. Well, I'm sorry, we're going to illustrate two extremes here. One extreme on the right is that the financial owners of the building who have the fiduciary and financial responsibility for the building will have to report everything. And then the other extreme is that it's the tenants that occupy the building, it's the tenants that use the building, so the reporting's going to be all on them. And from an owner perspective, it's like, it's not my problem, it's tenants' problems. So I can confidently say to everyone, it's going to end up somewhere in between these two, and there probably will be double reporting. And how that double reporting works and who ultimately takes responsibility is yet to be seen, but I think there is going to be some sort of reporting for the owner, even if they're not occupying the building. So what does this mean though in practice? So let's get into that a little more. So I've spoken to a number of different owners over the last few weeks and actually a few months. And I was sitting across the table from a pretty senior real estate guy, and he's like, 90% of real estate assets are privately held. This is a non-issue, was basically his point of view. And I'm like, okay, I totally get that. And then I also was on a call earlier today with a friend from New York City, and he was like, this is so far out of the SEC's jurisdiction, they have no right to do any of this. This is going to go to the Supreme Court. Yes, that's probably going to happen too. What's interesting though, is even if the building is privately held, there are limited partner owners that are institutional investors to the general partner who is the owner of the building itself. And a lot of those owners are insurance or insurance providers, and they provide equity or debt. Then you have sovereign wealth funds, and I should have spelled that out, I apologize. Then we have endowments and pension funds. Now, just to look at endowments for a second, I'm familiar with one Big Ten university who has no ESG reporting requirements, doesn't care about it at all. And every dollar they can raise through their endowment from whatever place it is great for the school. and that's their philosophy. But then there are other institutions like Harvard and Yale that have a lot of scrutiny and a lot of ESG obligations, and they will have to report all of the SEC disclosure items. And that's the same thing with pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and insurance providers. Some of them will absolutely have to do this. Some of them won't, but some of them absolutely will. And then any publicly traded tenant will need to report. And what's interesting about both the partners and the tenants, some of them are going to have to report. So this means the building owners need to have all of this data together to ASHRAE 14064 standards, regardless of whether or not they themselves have to report. Because they're going to have to provide this disclosure data to their limited partners, and they're going to have to provide this disclosure data to their publicly traded tenants. There are also companies like B Corps and non-publicly traded entities that may also want to report this as well. So the bottom line is you may not have to report as a building owner, but you will have to provide this data. And what's interesting about this too is that the need goes across all of the different types of commercial real estate. Obviously office and office tenants and have publicly traded office tenants, but it's also true for institutional buildings. And I'm sorry, infrastructure, institutional. There's what's the word? Industrial sector, my bad. All of those I words. But the industrial sector, data centers or distribution centers, a lot of those are publicly traded tenants. So there's going to be reporting needs there. Then in retail, there are a lot of publicly traded tenants there. And in multifamily, there are a lot of owners that will need to report out of that. So there isn't a market segment within commercial real estate that's, doesn't have to participate in this. And when you look at the future, what the ULI Data Forum is attempting to do in our long-term goal is to create a real estate asset profile. And this is a data file that's totally portable. And instead of using CSV, as tons of applications do, it will have a proper 3-letter acronym, maybe CRE. I have no idea if that's even available, but it's going to, the intent is that it's going to comprise of 3 elements. The first is the building data profile. This is the gross floor area, the number of floors, the total height of the building, the setback, the parcel PIN number, the floor area ratio, the gross floor area per floor, all of the typical information you'd see in the title, but also information that brokers would need, like the floor-to-floor heights and things like that. And so it's not a complex, it may potentially complex, but with office buildings, with senior living, with multifamily, with industrial, with retail, it's pretty easily quantifiable and it's pretty standardized. And we think that that will be one of the core aspects to it. And then the other will be the financial data profile. And in the industry for appraisals and valuations, there's an application called Argus, which is owned by a company called Altus. And Argus is frequently used in any appraisal or disclosure or refinancing or disposition and acquisition event. And that Argus file or profile will be something very similar to that, will be the basis of this, with some additional leasing information and probably some OpEx and CapEx information too. But that is going to lag behind. But the reason why I'm bringing up this is that the SEC disclosure requirements overlap both the physical building and the financial reporting. And when you look at the documents, and we'll do this in a moment, when you look at the documents that are used in leasing, in refinancing, or disposition and acquisition, the information that we look at and concentrate on a day-to-day basis, there's virtually none of that in the transaction documents. And this is the stuff that the owners are really focused on. And because of this SEC disclosure, it's my personal take that this is going to bring a greater focus on the physical asset itself and a greater need for understanding operational efficiency, because that then impacts net operating income and in essence their return on capital. So I'd like to leave it there and answer any questions that anyone has, and then I'd like to also share before the end of the call a bit about the framework. So
the premise of your thoughts is that real estate is going to be a regulated industry. Period.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for that. We talked a lot about that in the past, Anto, and I'm glad you brought that up. How does that sound? With the requirements, historically, there's been very little reporting and regulation, except when it comes to building code and things like that. But this is going to help transition the industry from an unregulated one to a regulated one. And it's going to put a lot more scrutiny on the owners and a lot more attention on the physical asset. So thank you, Anto, for reminding me of that.
So David, this is Mark Peacock. A couple questions that I have. So this initiative that you just shared with us, how do you see it working with other, I don't know if I want to call them regulations versus guidelines that the private sector is doing, such as Moody's? Moody's has a whole new ratings approach to a person's, an organization's ESG, net carb, whatever, and other government entities, whether they be national, such as we are seeing in the UK, or even some of the more aggressive cities that are developing or trying to develop their own. How do you see these all trying to work together? Are we going to have a mishmash that we have so many of them that nobody's going to do anything because they are so bloody confused on what to do and what not to do?
That's a great question. In terms of the ULI effort, let's put that aside for 1 second and just focus on the SEC disclosure. The SEC disclosure requirements will most likely be based around ISO 14064. And that has been adopted by Europe, by the EU, by Singapore, by Australia, New Zealand, and I do believe Canada as well. And so in terms of your disclosure reporting requirements and the financial disclosure around those utility bills and everything, it will follow that standard, and that standard is pretty much an international one, thankfully. So I think that seems to be pretty well put together and will be something that will happen with, centered around a single standard. When it comes to all of these other efforts, what we're trying to do at ULI is take inventory of these things. And, we don't want to reinvent the wheel by any means, and we want to capitalize on any good work that's already being done. And so this is where it really takes a consortium doing a concerted effort to pull all of these different things together. A lot of commercial real estate has used the European GRESB standard for reporting, and a lot of them are using Energy Star as well. And so we see, these things hopefully coming together, and I really think it will ultimately come around ISO standards and international standards that are more driven by the financial disclosure and financial side of the industry than anything else. Does that
Surely
answer the question, Mark? You're muted.
you're
Yeah,
muted.
no, thank you. It,
Yeah.
definitely. And,
Okay.
especially, I guess, too, is these larger consulting organizations, Ernst and Young, Capgemini, whomever globally, they are trying to get into the game as well, in that they are saying, if they're working with a building owner, operator, or whatever, they will help ensure as a service that their reporting is meeting the standards or what is required. Because again, too, in the financial sector, the banks, they've got their own as well too. So, it's just going to be interesting to see how this all comes together and plays. Hopefully everybody can play well together in the same sandbox.
Completely agree. And David Katz also brought up the GRESB reporting, which is something that's definitely going to be taken into consideration. From my understanding, though, the SEC requirements are going to be different than the GRESB reporting as it stands now. Any other
I think
questions?
the point here that I'd like to dig in some more is that if this presents the real estate industry as a regulated industry, which is not what it is today or in the past, then we keep on talking on Monday Live about drivers to extract the data and make use of the information. Does this sort of change in paradigm, let's put it that way, into a regulated industry? Does that help or hinder us, or what? There must be some impact to that change.
I really see that the move towards scrutiny and disclosure and the attendant requirements will definitely be adding discipline where there's virtually none now. And it'll also add an accountability to owners of assets to take, I think, more of an active role in their operation. And that means, I hope, more follow-on for seeking more smarter and interoperable digital buildings and moving towards a digital asset management workflow with digital twins.
So, David, I've got two questions or comments to bring up. One, do you know whether the SEC is having conversations with the real estate community in the development of these regulations? Because this is absolutely going to increase the costs of running their operations.
That's a great question. Yes, they are. And there are, I think, 2 main committees working on this. And the cost, the thing is, when you look, there are undoubtedly going to be costs around all of the unknowns, like the refrigerants, for instance. But the costs around your energy bill and natural gas bill and water bill, you should be able to get all of that data from your utility provider, or if you're buying your own energy and just having it, get to your building via the grid with the distribution, then you have your energy provider data.
Okay.
So I think on one side, it isn't a heavy lift because they already have these bills anyway, and they're just going to have to disclose them in an official manner. But yes, the like embodied carbon and the refrigerants and things like that, I see that being a lot more onerous and costly. That's why I see those things lagging in time.
So my second question is the driving force behind this greenhouse gases? Is that why this is being done?
It's really being, well, that's the global climate change is absolutely one of the initiatives, but the other, and the reason why the SEC is driving this, is there are lots of organizations that are claiming, with their offset, they're a net zero company, and it's bullshit and it's greenwashing, and the SEC is putting it out there, which is their role, saying, if you're going to make these claims, you need to back them up with real data. And that's really the driver here, is publicly traded companies can't make false claims and mislead investors. And so they're really saying, if you're going to claim this, you have to be able to back it up, and back it up in a formal manner. And one thing to add to this too, is one of the guys working on these committees, who's a friend of mine based here in Chicago, he's been working for years doing these disclosures for the oil and gas industry. So these are well-worn paths for other industries that are now being applied to the real estate industry.
But it's fair to say, tell me if I'm right in saying, it's fair to say that the greenhouse gases and the belief that they are impacting negatively climate change is the driving conversation behind why this regulation is needed.
Politically, I think that's that is what will get us into a mess in this country. And I actually, think that the SEC is purely hanging on the line. If you're disclosing these things, it has to be done in this way. And if you're making these claims, it has to be backed up. And this way they're avoiding is there climate change or is there not climate change? They're just saying, hey, you're a publicly traded company, you need to disclose your claims.
Okay. All right, good. Thanks for making that distinction. That's great. That's very helpful.
Yeah. There was a question here by Gregory. Will state, federal, and local government have to report? The GSA is absolutely planning on reporting. As for state and local jurisdictions, I think that's on a state-by-state, case-by-case basis. France has a nice grading system. Yes, and we should adopt something like that. Okay.
You want to move to talking about the data
Yes,
stuff
please.
that you're doing? Go ahead.
That would be great.
That'd be great.
So,
thank you.
And I should have fixed this slide. There's three. It's master data, which doesn't change that much. Transactional data, which changes a lot more frequently. And then metadata, which is how you organize everything. And what we're attempting to do is create a framework for human understanding. There is a ton of data in the industry. And yes, it's overwhelming, but it's overwhelming until you have a mental framework for it and can put things in their place. And so this data framework is really an attempt to organize all of the data in the industry, but also set the industry on a better course. And so the 0D stuff is think of all the public domain data you can get from FEMA, NOAA, HUD, the Census, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, everything you can think of that gives context to your project and your building or development in the context of where it's being built. And with the owner and tenant information, this includes what's called in the ISO 19650 standards, organizational requirements. So these SEC disclosure requirements would be a perfect example of the owner requirements that would go into this category. All too frequently, as we all know, there are no service level agreements, there are no reporting requirements, and there's very little year-on-year improvement tracking and things like that that an owner or a primary tenant has for a building. And the idea with the 1D section is not only would you know who these people are and what their organization is, but also what are their requirements for information from the management of the building and from the building itself. And then the service providers, that's your design team, construction team, and then the operations team. And it's all the information and agreements with those groups. 3D is all of the master data and documentation. That's your models. That's your, all the documentation for the drawings, the permits, the submittals, everything would fall into this 3D category, including specifications. But we're thinking of focusing it around the master data category, and then the assemblies like the roof assembly, curtain wall assemblies, all to uniformat, and then the systems to master format. And then schedule and time, the fourth dimension, and 3D, 4D, 5D follows the common thinking in the world of BIM, where 4D is time and 5D is money. Then 6D is the transactional data generated by all the building systems once the building is in operation. And this is all of the data that comes and goes from all the systems, and at heart, the interoperability of a digital building. And then 7D is considered the insight or business intelligence layer. Once you have all of this information, you can really start to get insight and business intelligence information once it's all together. And we're trying to put together a list of any and all standards that are in use across the industry for these different categories. And some overlap the categories for sure. But, we're just starting this effort, and, things like GRESB aren't shown here yet. But things like BOMA, for the measurements, we definitely see that being a part of it. And so we're writing a white paper between now and the fall ULI, where we're going to try to include all of this. And Mark Haystack is on here in asset systems data. And I was sure to put that on, knowing I was getting on this call. And before I turn it over to open discussion, I also wanted to share that we're trying to come up with an inventory of all of the standard documents that are utilized. And so they're all the standard documents that folks on this call are used to doing design and construction and operations, and all the drawings and specs that go along with that, and the submittals and the cut sheets and all of that. Put that to one side. This list that you see on the screen are the documents that are needed to get a real estate construction, in essence, mortgage or loan for an asset that's $20 million or less. And these are the documents that you'd have to go to the bank and have in hand to do this. And the point I wanted to make of this is, when you look at an integrated digital smart building, very little of that goes into these documents. And I'm purely pointing this out to say, at ULI, they're mostly focused on buying and selling assets and holding it for 5 years and getting out and getting a return on capital. And they're not focused frequently on the building asset itself, how it operates in the granular side of the physical asset. And so in this audience, I just wanted to show that, hey, there's still an uphill battle with owners. And this is where I think, we can start to see some convergence here and we're at this neat inflection point.
David, this is a very impressive list, and I totally get for new construction and development or even recently built buildings, but you know, a large fraction of the building stock in the world is not new. How
Correct.
do you see this applying to that?
So what's very interesting is, I think a good example is Heinz, where they have a good reputation of selling existing assets and going through disposition where they get a higher than market value for the property. Now, obviously office Armageddon is happening right now. So, you know, current period aside, but a better documented building with better operational best practices and more transparency commands a higher valuation at sale than one that doesn't have all this information. And so I see this as a transition in the industry where buildings that have this information will tend to outperform ones that don't, if it were the same building. And when you put this together with the SEC disclosure requirements, I see a lot of owners, it's very similar to the federal government going to automobile manufacturers in the 60s saying, you know, you should think about seatbelts. And the automobile manufacturers like, nobody will wear them. You're probably safer getting launched out of the car than getting crushed in the car, you know, and no one wants to pay more money for seatbelts anyway. Flash forward to now, 60 years later, where the crash test scores are one of the key buying decisions for a car. And I really see the industry transitioning to a well-run, well-documented building commanding a higher price. And this is the path, I think, for the industry to get there.
Right. So it's going to cost a lot, but it's worth it.
Yeah, but I would say it's not, to me, like when you're going to sell a building, when you're going through disposition, as it's called, they set up a war room, and they, in essence, a conference room, and they have like a bunch of analysts and accountants pulling all these documents together, and they spend, you know, hundreds and thousands of hours pulling everything together from shared drives and all the different places these things are. And it's incredibly stupid how poorly they're managing all this data. And my point is that, you know, if you just go through one disposition acquisition cycle, that's when you have all this together. So get it organized and put it in place. And it's a thing where it's kind of also adopting a better digital workflow for owners as well.
Hey, David, Mark Peacock again. One quick question, yes or no?
No.
Is this, other than the public organizations, those who are publicly traded or whatever,
Yeah.
do you think building owners and operators have agreed or adopted the benefit of ESG, decarb, and net zero, whatever, fill in the blank?
I would absolutely say yes. When you look at the endowments and the pension funds, they're absolutely doing that. When you look at the California ones and the New York ones, those are the two biggest pension funds in the world. They're all about ESG. And they're all about ESG when it comes to real estate as well. And so, you know, just using that as an example, and then let's take JBG Smith, that's a publicly traded REIT based in DC. You know, you go to their website, they have a full complete section on ESG and you know, their approach to it. And they're doing Energy Star, they're doing GRESB, and they got really high scores, you know, for their ESG rating last year. So I think there are definitely people and organizations who are embracing this and going for it, even if some, you know, are not.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, Audrey, as from an environmental perspective. Would you mind chiming in a little bit?
It's a very general question, my thoughts from an environmental perspective.
Yeah, well, do that.
You know, I mean, everything that David's talking about, again, I'm going to bring up just Seattle because that's what I know and that's what I'm involved with. These are the kinds of conversations that we're having with building owners here. As the city is pushing for this Electrify Seattle campaign to electrify the buildings, get rid of, you know, gas furnaces, et cetera, we're having conversations with building owners saying, you know, what would it take for you to get on board with this? You know, especially your last point, David, about the retirement investments in New York and California, their names are escaping me, but those are the ones that are saying, yes, this is what we want. We want the highest type of building stock that meets all of these standards. So I think things that go hand in hand are real estate with policy, right? Yeah, that's what I'm ruminating on right now.
And I think it's interesting too, because for instance, the buildings in New York City has been pushing hard, and they actually, you know, started the reporting a few years ago. And then they offered incentives to building owners to make their buildings more efficient and to do these conversions. And it was largely ignored. And now they had the window of time to address things. Now building owners are getting fined for not doing things. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is these pension funds now are like, you know, I don't want to name any REITs because but like Mr. REIT, we're not going to invest in any more of your assets because we don't know if there's undisclosed risk here for us. Mm-hmm. And these are liabilities. And until you're reporting and following the rules, there are these potential liabilities that are undiscovered. And so this, you know, from a financial standpoint, it's going to matter to these owners. Anybody else have any difficult questions?
Greg,
right.
you look poised to say something. Why don't you do a wrap on this, because we're at the top of the hour anyway.
I'll pose it as a question to David. It's like, I believe, and I want to see if you agree, that owners are actually understand the value of data and they understand the risk of not having data when they go to make decisions. And, you know, accounting systems are an example. Carfax is an example. There's lots of places where digitization and data has proven to be valuable, and the lack of data has proven to be risky and costly. Is that what you're seeing? Don't just say yes.
We're at the inflection point where we're going literally from think of hand typed spreadsheets as analog. We're going from analog to digital now. And there's no ERP, there's no SAP or Oracle for real estate asset management. And that's why that's what we're building at my company, Digital Master Planning. We see this massive opportunity because no one's leveraging digital tools to take asset management to the next level. I mean, that's a broad, gross generalization. Most are not leveraging data to take asset management to the next level.
Well, digitization is never easy in any industry. This will be my wrap. And it's proven to be difficult in a lot of industries. In some ways, we are actually lucky that we didn't try and start it 15 years ago to make it easy, because now the tools are available to make digitization much easier, much faster, much more logical and easy to consume and cheaper. So it's a good time for us to be like joining the party, I think.
Yep.
And appreciate your work on that.
Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you guys for the forum to share all of this, and happy to follow up with anyone that may have questions.
Thank you, David. Thanks for the great perspective. And this wraps the show. Thanks, Audrey, for contributing as well. Sorry for the generalization. But we'll get the video of this up tomorrow or Wednesday. Otherwise, have a great day. Have a great week.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Cheers.